Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
It is so great to be here for another deep dive.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want you to imagine, just for a moment, inheriting a sprawling organization that is just on the absolute verge of collapse.
Oh, man. That is the ultimate nightmare scenario for any leader.
Right. Like, you've been handpicked to step into this CEO role, but the situation on the ground is just a complete disaster. The internal culture is toxic.
Totally fractured, I'm guessing.
Exactly. It's fractured by these massive egos, and they're clashing over like the most pedantic, trivial details.
Yeah, you see that a lot. People weaponizing the company rule book, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Weaponizing the rules to settle personal vendettas. And if that wasn't enough, the external pressure is just crushing.
Oh, so it's not just an inside problem.
Not at all. You are operating in an environment surrounded by a hostile government and, well, a society that fundamentally despises your existence. Like, they are actively looking for a reason to shut you down permanently.
Wow. That's a pressure cooker.
It really is. So the question is, how do you stop the infighting? How do you establish real functioning authority without just, becoming another tyrant?
Right. And most importantly, how do you keep the entire movement from just completely imploding?
Exactly. And the crazy part is that scenario isn't some hypothetical business school case study. It is the very real on-the-ground reality that we are unpacking in today's deep dive.
It's intense. It really is a crucible that tests whether a movement actually has the resilience to survive human nature.
It really does. Today, we are opening up the biblical book of 1 Timothy. And this is a deeply personal, really high-stakes mentor's letter written by the Apostle Paul to his young protege, Timothy.
And Paul had left Timothy in this bustling, incredibly complex city, right, Ephesus.
Right, Ephesus. He leaves him there to fix a community that was rapidly going off the rails. And to help us decode all of this, we're bringing in the insights of two classic, brilliant commentators, Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry.
Two absolute heavyweights.
Yeah, their stuff is incredible. Our goal here is to extract the practical wisdom, the moral psychology, and, the real-life application from this text that honestly still hits incredibly hard today.
And to really grasp the weight of this letter, you kind of have to understand the ground Timothy was standing on. Ephesus was not some quiet backwater village.
Not at all?
No, it was the absolute crown jewel of Asia Minor. Imagine a collision of modern-day Wall Street, Las Vegas, and like a major political capital all rolled into one.
That is quite the visual.
Right. It was a massive hub of international commerce. And it was also the center of this dominant pagan cult. It was home to the Temple of Artemis, which was, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world.
Wow, so the whole city's identity was tied up in that.
Completely. The city's entire economy was entangled with the worship, the tourism, and the silversmith guilds associated with that temple. So it was wealthy, it was pluralistic, and it was deeply suspicious of this new radical Christian movement.
And right in the middle of this high-pressure environment, Paul leaves Timothy behind. Because the internal community is self-destructing. The crisis wasn't just the external persecution, it was internal sabotage.
Which is always the hardest part to manage.
Always. Certain teachers inside the group had just completely lost the plot. They were corrupting the core message with endless debates, obsessive rule following, and fabricated myths.
Yeah, they were entirely off track.
So Paul writes this letter, and what fascinates me is his opening move. Because, if I were brought in to fix a broken corporate culture, my first move would probably be to just fire the toxic managers.
Right. Fire them and distribute a strict, updated code of conduct. That's standard crisis management.
Exactly. But Paul completely bypasses the administrative checklist. He goes straight for the underlying motivation.
He really does. He starts by defining the ultimate purpose of any healthy community. Or really, any set of rules, for that matter. In the opening chapter, he contrasts the ideal outcome with the toxic behaviors tearing the Ephesians apart.
Which is such a brilliant leadership move.
It is. Paul explicitly states that the entire goal of his instructions, what the text actually calls the end of the commandment, isn't to win theological arguments.
Right. It's not about who has the highest IQ.
Exactly. It isn't to prove who possesses the most obscure knowledge. The singular goal, he says, is to produce love from a pure heart, a good conscience, and sincere faith. That is the metric for success.
Love from a pure heart, a good conscience, and sincere faith. I mean, that completely reorients the goalposts.
It changes everything.
Yeah, because the problem was that the loudest voices in Ephesus had entirely missed that mark. They had swerved into what the older translations call vein jangling.
Vein jangling. I love that phrase.
I do too. I have to stop on it because it perfectly captures a phenomenon we see everywhere today. You read about these Ephesian teachers obsessing over endless genealogies and meaningless debates, and it sounds exactly like watching people get sucked into toxic internet rabbit holes.
Oh, absolutely. Or dealing with that one coworker who sends, a 10-paragraph email arguing over some minor procedural detail,
while the actual project goes up in flames. Yes, it's the illusion of productivity. It's information overload masquerading as wisdom.
That is a highly accurate parallel.
Yeah.
Matthew Henry actually offers a brilliant analysis of this. He points out that jangling in matters of religion or philosophy is utterly vain because it settles absolutely no permanent principle of truth.
Wow, so it's just noise.
Just noise. You can debate these trivial things for a lifetime, and it fails entirely to make the human heart any better. You might win the argument, but your conscience remains completely untouched.
That is a massive indictment of how we spend so much of our time online today.
It really is. And Barnes adds some crucial historical context here, too. He notes that these teachers were likely diving into really complicated, perplexing genealogical tables, trying to trace their lineage back to specific patriarchs.
Wait, really? So they were arguing about who had the better family tree. That's just a status game.
Precisely. It was entirely a status game. It led directly to questions of rank and precedence. It was a way of establishing a hierarchy of worth within a community that was supposed to be completely egalitarian.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, Henry bluntly states that they desired to be teachers without understanding what they were even talking about. They had the ambition for the office, they wanted the microphone, but they lacked the actual substance to lead.
Which is a terrifying combination. Ambition without understanding almost always leads to weaponizing the rules to protect your own ego.
Every single time.
And that's exactly what was happening. These guys wanted to be teachers of the law, but they were using it as a bludgeon to control people. So Paul has to step in and recalibrate the community's entire relationship with rules and authority.
Right, and this requires a tremendous amount of discernment. Both Barnes and Henry make it clear in their commentaries that the law-like, the moral guardrails of society, is not meant to fetter the conscience with heavy, cumbrous ceremonies.
Okay, so it's not meant to be a burden.
No, nor is it made for the righteous to brag about how perfectly they keep it. Paul says the law is made for the lawless and disobedient. It is meant to restrain the ungodly, the abusive, the perjurers, the violent.
So, to put it in modern terms, the law isn't a ladder you climb to prove you're superior to everyone else. It's more like a reinforced fence designed to keep people from walking off a cliff and taking society down with them.
That's a great way to put it.
But what really stops me in my tracks here is what Paul does next. Because right after he lays out this dark, intense list of sins that the law is meant to restrain, he makes a leadership move that violates almost every rule of modern PR.
Oh, he completely torpedoes his own image.
He does. He openly, brutally confesses his own dark past. He calls himself a former blasphemer, a persecutor, and an insolent, violent man. He even labels himself the chief of sinners.
It is a remarkable moment of vulnerability, and frankly, it goes against everything we are taught about leadership today.
Seriously, I mean, modern leaders are conditioned to project invulnerability.
Exactly. You manage your personal brand, you spin your failures into learning opportunities, you certainly don't voluntarily bring up the time you actively, violently tried to destroy the very organization you now lead.
Which is exactly what Paul did before his conversion. Yeah, if you're trying to establish Timothy's authority and calm a rebellious faction in Ephesus, why would you remind everyone that his mentor used to hunt down and kill the people in this movement?
Right, you'd think it would ruin his credibility.
It seems like you're just handing free ammunition to your critics.
You would think so, but Matthew Henry points out that this is an expression of profound, authentic humility that actually serves a massive strategic and theological purpose.
Okay, how so?
Paul is using his own life as the ultimate case study. He explicitly says he is a pattern. The logic is foolproof. If the divine could have extreme, abundant patience with Paul, the ultimate enemy, the guy actively destroying the church, then there is abundant mercy available for absolutely anyone.
Oh, wow. So he's weaponizing his own failure for good.
Exactly. He dismantles the toxic elitism of the false teachers by proving that the grace of this movement is infinitely more powerful than the worst human track record.
He strips away all the posturing. He's essentially saying, you guys are arguing over who has the purest lineage, and I'm telling you, I was a literal terrorist, yet I was shown mercy.
It completely changes the temperature of the room.
It really does. It makes you look at your own interactions differently, doesn't it? Like if you are listening to this and dealing with conflict at work or arguing in the comment section of a social media post, it forces a real reflection.
A hard reflection. Yeah.
Is your ultimate goal in that interaction to produce love from a pure heart and a good conscience? Or are you just engaging in vain jangling because your ego desperately needs a win?
It demands a complete surrender of the ego. And that internal surrender is the only way the community can prepare for the next massive challenge Paul gives them.
Which brings us to chapter 2, right?
Exactly, because once you've stripped the arrogance out of your internal debates, the logical next step is figuring out how this community faces the outside world. How do they interact with a society that hates them?
Right. And Paul issues an instruction here that, historically speaking, could have gotten them all killed.
It was incredibly dangerous.
He tells them to pray, but not just for safety or for their own people. He urges that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and givings of thanks be made for all men, and specifically for kings and for all that are in authority.
We really need to pause and absorb the historical weight of this. These early Christians were a marginalized, often despised minority living under the absolute brutal authority of the pagan Roman Empire.
Right. They were not the ones in power.
Not at all. The authorities they're being commanded to pray for were the very people heavily taxing them, oppressing them, and periodically subjecting them to horrific violence.
Wait, I really have to push back on this. Paul is telling them to pray for the emperor. Depending on the exact dating of this letter, we are talking about Nero, or at least the Roman machine that Nero operated.
Yes, exactly. The Nero regime.
The same authorities that were literally throwing dissidents to the lions. From a modern political standpoint, that sounds less like spiritual fortitude and more like rolling over for your oppressors. I mean, how on earth did they justify blessing the boot on their own neck?
It's a completely valid reaction, and it's honestly why this instruction is so radically subversive. Paul isn't telling them to endorse the tyranny.
Okay.
He says the goal of these prayers is so the community may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and honesty. Barnes explains that this universal prayer was rooted in a theological earthquake.
A theological earthquake.
Yeah. Paul states, "For there is one God and one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus, who gave himself a ransom for all."
So how does that theology actually subvert the political reality they were living in?
Well, in the ancient world, deities were intensely tribal and territorial. The Romans had their pantheon, the Greeks had theirs, the Egyptians had theirs. You prayed to your local god for victory and dominance over the other nation's local god.
Right. It was very geographically bound.
Exactly. And the emperor himself was often viewed as divine. But Paul comes in and says, no, there is only one God over the entire human race, and there is only one mediator.
Oh, I see where this is going.
By praying to the one true God for the emperor, the early Christians were subtly but firmly declaring that the emperor was not a god.
Wow, that is brilliant.
He was just a man who desperately needed the mercy and guidance of the actual king of the universe.
By praying for him, you are simultaneously humanizing him and demoting him from divine status. You're recognizing his temporal authority while totally denying his ultimate authority.
Precisely. And because there's only one God, he desires the salvation of all people, kings, slaves, Romans, Jews. Therefore, your prayers must be as universal as God's reach. You cannot hoard grace.
That concept of the one mediator is so crucial here. Matthew Henry uses an analogy in his commentary that I found absolutely fascinating. He describes this mediator as a daysman, or an umpire.
A daysman.
Ah.
It's a wonderful, archaic legal term.
It is. And the idea of the daysman is someone who has the standing to lay a hand on both opposing parties to bridge an impossible, uncrossable gap.
Right.
In this theology, God is infinitely holy, and humanity is broken, rebellious, and finite. The gap cannot be bridged from our side. But Jesus, being both divine and human, stands in the middle.
He bridges the gap.
Exactly. He can lay a hand on the shoulder of the divine and a hand on the shoulder of humanity and negotiate the peace. He is the ultimate diplomat who stepped in and paid the ransom himself. And because that ransom was for all, the community is mandated to pray for all.
It completely levels the playing field of humanity. But as we move through this second chapter, we hit a section that we simply cannot gloss over because it is undeniably difficult for modern readers to parse.
Yeah, things get pretty complicated here.
Paul transitions from universal prayer into highly specific, culturally charged instructions regarding women. He writes that women should adorn themselves modestly, learn in silence, and not usurp authority over men.
Yeah, let's face this head on, because, if you just read those verses with a 21st century lens, stripped of any historical context, it sounds incredibly dismissive. It sounds like systemic oppression wrapped in religious language.
It really does sound that way today.
How do our guides, Barnes and Henry, help us understand what was actually happening on the ground in Ephesus to provoke this specific command?
Well, we have to remember, we are peering through a keyhole into a highly structured ancient Oriental culture. A world where the social order, the public spheres, and the contact between the sexes were rigidly circumscribed.
Very different from today.
Completely different. Matthew Henry notes that while public, authoritative teaching in the gathered assembly was restricted by Paul here, women in this movement absolutely taught in other capacities.
Okay, so it wasn't a total gag order.
Not at all. We see vital examples like Priscilla, who took the great orator Apollos aside and taught him accurate theology, or Timothy's own mother and grandmother, who were actually his primary theological instructors.
That's a really important distinction. It wasn't a blanket ban on women possessing or sharing theological knowledge. In fact, if you look closely at the text, Paul explicitly commands, let the woman learn.
Which was huge back then.
Huge. In an ancient world that routinely denied formal education to women and treated them as property, commanding that women be taught the deep theology of the movement was actually a radical step forward. The method of learning in quietness reflects the social structure of the first century, but the mandate to learn was revolutionary.
Absolutely. And we must apply that same historical lens to the instructions regarding clothing. Paul prohibits braided hair, gold, pearls, and costly array.
Which, again, to a modern ear, that just sounds like a strict, joyless dress code. Like, why do you care about jewelry?
But Barnes highlights that this was a direct, necessary pushback against the extreme, distracting gaudiness of the Roman era.
Right, because we aren't talking about wearing a nice pair of earrings here. We were talking about the extreme flaunting of wealth.
Exactly. Wealthy women in the Roman Empire would literally weave gold thread and heavy jewels into massive, towering hairstyles.
Mm-hmm.
They wore fabrics that cost more than a commodore would earn in a lifetime.
Wow.
It was a calculated display of sheer economic dominance and social superiority.
So it wasn't just some patriarchal rule about don't look too pretty. It was a socioeconomic mandate. Paul is saying, stop bringing your toxic wealth displays into a community where the impoverished slave and the wealthy master are supposed to be sitting side by side as equals.
That's exactly it.
If you walk in dripping with gold, you are reestablishing the very social hierarchy that the gospel just dismantled. It's an anti-elitism policy.
That is exactly the point. The enduring wisdom here is about finding one's primary ornament in good works, rather than flashy displays of wealth and status. It's about modesty of the ego, not just hem lengths.
That's a great way to phrase it. Modesty of the ego.
We have to be intellectually honest and acknowledge that specific cultural applications, like the mechanics of silence in a first-century Ephesian gathering, reflect an ancient social order dealing with specific disruptions.
Right.
But the core principle remains deeply relevant. Our outward presentation and our egos shouldn't distract from the communal focus, and true beauty is forged in character, not purchased.
That reframes it completely. It's about stripping away the societal flexes that divide us.
Sure.
So if we pull this all together for someone listening right now, the challenge is intensely practical.
Very practical.
To go back to that radical instruction on prayer, how often do you genuinely pray for or wish well upon the political leaders or public figures you fundamentally despise? Can you humanize the people you disagree with?
It's incredibly hard to do.
It really is. The challenge is to practice lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting in your own civic life. It forces your own heart to change before you even attempt to change the political landscape.
And that internal change is absolutely vital, because if you are going to maintain a peaceful community that actively prays for its enemies and bridges massive socioeconomic divides, you desperately need leaders who embody those exact traits.
Which leads us straight into chapter 3.
Exactly. You cannot fake that kind of culture. It has to flow from the top down. And that perfectly sets up the architecture of leadership that Paul lays out next.
Yes, so moving into chapter 3, Paul lists his famous qualifications for the leaders of this community. He talks about bishops, which just translates to overseers or elders and deacons, who were the servants managing the logistics.
The administrative backbone.
Right. Now, I find this list fascinating because of what is missing. If I were writing a job description for a startup founder or a modern CEO, I'd be looking for visionary genius, aggressive growth metrics, a magnetic personality, maybe a massive social media following.
Of course. That's what we value today.
But Paul's list, it's almost entirely a checklist of emotional regulation and quiet family management. He says they must be blameless, vigilant, sober, given to hospitality, apt to teach, not violent, and not greedy for money.
The contrast is jarring. In our modern culture, we heavily prioritize charisma. We want the dynamic speaker who can rally the troops. Paul prioritizes character and emotional stability.
He's looking for steady hands.
Henry makes a brilliant observation here regarding the text's focus on the home. Paul writes, "If a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God?"
That's a very fair question.
Henry observes that if a person cannot govern their private sphere with gravity, grace, and patience, if they are chaotic, reactive, and tyrannical behind closed doors, they have zero business trying to govern a complex public organization.
It is the ultimate integrity test. Who are you when the cameras are off? Who are you when there is no audience to applaud you? The text asks, are you a striker? Meaning, are you physically or verbally combative? Are you quick to escalate a situation? Are you a brawler with your words? Because if you are, Paul says you are completely disqualified.
No exceptions.
It doesn't matter how gifted you are at public speaking. If your private life is a war zone, you cannot lead this community.
And there's another massive disqualifier that Paul points out, which acts as a profound psychological warning. He explicitly forbids promoting a novice to a position of high leadership.
This one is huge.
It is. The reasoning he gives is chilling. Lest being lifted up with pride, he fall into the condemnation of the devil.
I really want to drill down into this because the modern parallels are everywhere. Yeah. Putting a novice, like a new convert who hasn't been tested by time in charge of a spiritual community, is like handing $50 million in venture capital funding to an unmentored 19-year-old who just had one good idea.
That is a perfect analogy.
It might look incredibly exciting for a minute, the press will love it, but the rapid elevation without deep roots almost always ends in a spectacular public disaster.
The neurobiology and psychology of it are devastating. Both Barnes and Henry point out that ignorance and pride are frequent companions.
Oh, that's so true.
When you take someone who hasn't had their character forged in the slow, unglamorous fires of obscurity, and you suddenly give them a platform, authority, and adoration, the human ego simply cannot process it safely.
It shorts out the system.
They become lifted up. They start to believe their own hype. The reference to the condemnation of the devil is a theological callback. It implies that unchecked pride was the original downfall of the adversary, and it will inevitably be the downfall of the untested leader.
We see this exact tragedy play out constantly today. The brilliant young tech founder or the charismatic young influencer who flames out spectacularly, leaving a trail of abused employees and broken relationships behind them.
It happens all the time.
Why? Because their character couldn't sustain the weight of their talent. Paul is saying, do not do that to them, and do not do that to your community. Let them be proved first. Let time do its work. And that rigorous testing applies to the deacons as well, right? The people handling the logistics.
Absolutely. The deacons were the operational backbone of the church. They managed the temporal concerns, the charity, the food distribution for the poor, the finances.
The heavy lifting.
Because they were constantly handling the funds and navigating sensitive family situations, the requirement that they not be greedy, a filthy lucre, or double-tongued was critical to the survival of the movement.
Double-tongued. That's such a great phrase, saying one thing to one person and a completely different thing to someone else to manipulate the outcome.
Yes. Barnes points out that a double-tongued person cannot be trusted with logistics and money because they will inevitably play favorites and breed distrust.
It creates chaos.
And Paul notes that their wives, or the women serving alongside them as deaconesses, must also be grave, sober, and absolutely not slanderers.
Right, because if the people running the charity supply chain are gossiping about the people they are helping, the entire system rots from the inside out.
Exactly. The integrity of the mission depended entirely on the quiet, tested character of the people running it.
It's so grounded in the gritty reality of human nature. But then, right at the end of this incredibly pragmatic HR checklist, Paul does something surprising.
He makes quite the pivot.
He does. He suddenly shifts gears into poetry. He drops this massive, soaring summary of the Christian faith, which he calls the mystery of godliness. He writes, God was manifest in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen of angels, preached unto the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up into glory.
It's a beautiful verse.
It's beautiful, but structurally it feels really abrupt.
Yeah.
Why drop a cosmic theological poem right after telling people not to drink too much wine and to manage their kids?
It's a deliberate juxtaposition. Barnes notes that this mystery isn't something unintelligible, like a riddle you can't solve. In the ancient world, a mystery was a profound truth that was formerly hidden, but has now been triumphantly revealed.
Okay, so it's a revelation.
By placing this grand truth that the divine actually became human, entered our mess, broke down the ethnic walls between Jews and Gentiles, and leveled the playing field for the whole world, right after the mundane leadership qualifications, Paul is raising the stakes.
He's connecting the mundane to the cosmic.
Exactly. He is saying, this is what is at stake. You aren't just managing a local social club or a charity organization. You are the stewards of the greatest, most inclusive, most universe-altering truth ever revealed. Therefore, your character has to match the immense dignity of the message.
Wow. Your character has to match the dignity of the message. That is the audit every leader needs to run on themselves.
It's a heavy responsibility.
Before you seek a higher title or demand more influence or try to build a bigger platform, examine your private life. Are you a brawler in your text threads? Are you double-tongued at work, playing office politics to get ahead? Do you actually rule your own domain with peace?
Because charisma can open a door, but only character can keep the building from collapsing.
Perfectly said. And that robust, time-tested character is going to be desperately needed because Paul isn't just preparing them for everyday management. As he shifts into the next phase of his letter, chapter 4, he issues a dark warning.
Yeah, the tone shifts dramatically here.
The reason these leaders need to be so solid is because a storm of deception is gathering on the horizon. The text takes a very intense turn here. Paul writes that the Spirit expressly warns that in later times, some will depart from the faith.
Apostasy.
Right. And the way they depart is by giving heed to seducing spirits, speaking lies and hypocrisy, and having their consciences seared with a hot iron. That phrase, a seared conscience, is a terrifying visceral image.
It is a devastating medical and psychological metaphor. When flesh is seared or cauterized with a hot iron, the nerve endings are destroyed. It leaves behind scar tissue that can no longer feel pain or sensation.
Because they literally become numb.
Matthew Henry points out that men must be incrementally hardened, their moral nerve endings systematically destroyed, before they can fully depart from the truth and confidently draw others into their lies.
That is chilling.
But what is truly fascinating about this passage is what this demonic doctrine actually looks like in practice.
Right, because when I hear phrases like doctrine of devils or seducing spirits, my mind immediately goes to a horror movie. Or at the very least, I picture a complete descent into lawlessness. You imagine people abandoning all rules, plunging into absolute hedonism, violence, and chaos.
That is the logical assumption, but it's completely wrong in this context. According to the text, the demonic doctrine that will sear their consciences is extreme, performative legalism.
Wait, the great apostasy, the demonic deception, is hyper-holiness.
Yes. The text explicitly says they will forbid to marry and command to abstain from meats. Sometimes, the most toxic religion masquerades as extreme piety.
Oh, that is so manipulative.
The commentators, Henry and Barnes, note how this maps historically onto proto-Gnostic movements and later religious asceticism. These movements imposed unnatural austerities, like forced celibacy or rigid obsessive dietary laws, to control people.
So it's a bait and switch. You think you're getting closer to God by denying yourself marriage or certain foods, but you're actually just feeding your own spiritual pride and submitting to human tyranny.
Exactly. It looks incredibly spiritual on the outside, but it destroys liberty. It's a way for leaders to exercise absolute control over the minute details of their followers' lives. They ban what the Creator designed to be enjoyed.
That makes a lot of sense.
And Paul counters this beautifully and decisively. He declares, Every creature of God is good, and nothing to be refused if it be received with thanksgiving. It's a profound defense of the inherent goodness of the physical material world.
That is so refreshing. God created the physical world, so the physical world is not inherently evil. Enjoy your food, enjoy marriage, just be grateful.
Yes, gratitude is the key.
And this leads right into a really interesting comparison Paul makes between physical and spiritual discipline. He writes, "Bodily exercise profiteth little, but godliness is profitable unto all things." Now, I have to ask, bodily exercise profiteth little. Does this mean I can cancel my gym membership? Is taking care of our physical health a waste of time in the grand scheme of things?
It's a very common misreading to think Paul is dismissing physical health, but no. The Greek word for little here can mean for a little time or for a limited scope.
Oh, okay.
The text is actually acknowledging that bodily exercise does have value. It profits you for your physical lifespan. You will feel better, live longer, and have more energy. But Paul is establishing a hierarchy of investment.
It's about the ROI, the return on investment.
Precisely. Physical discipline yields dividends for the few decades you are alive on earth in this body. But spiritual discipline, godliness, yields dividends in both the life that now is and of that which is to come. It pays out in eternity.
So it's the ultimate long-term investment.
Exactly. So do not neglect the physical, but absolutely do not elevate the physical above the spiritual.
That makes total sense. You want to invest your heaviest capital in the asset that has the longest payout period. And then Paul ends this section by speaking directly to Timothy's own insecurities. Timothy is young, and he's trying to lead older, wealthy, established men in Ephesus.
Well, they had to be intimidating.
Paul tells him, "Let no man despise thy youth, but be thou an example of the believers in word, in conversation, in charity, in spirit, in faith, in purity."
It is a masterclass in how to handle being underestimated. Paul doesn't tell Timothy to demand respect or to throw his weight around or to remind everyone that he has apostolic backing. He tells him to outlive them.
Yes. If you are listening to this and you constantly feel underestimated, maybe because of your age, your background, your gender, or your lack of a fancy degree, how do you respond?
It's a tough spot to be in.
It is. Do you get defensive and demand respect? Or do you command respect by being an absolutely undeniable example in your work ethic, your behavior, and your integrity? You don't argue your way into authority. You live your way into it.
And living your way into authority means getting your hands dirty with the actual messy realities of a community. Which brings us to chapter 5.
The really practical stuff.
Very.
Yeah.
Because practicing true godliness isn't just about your private prayer life or avoiding theological debates. It immediately translates into economics. It translates into how a community functions and how it cares for its most vulnerable members. This chapter is a fascinating, gritty look into the social welfare, justice, and nuance of discipline in the ancient church.
This might be the most practical section of the whole letter. We are talking about the ancient welfare system. Let's paint the picture of the historical reality here. In the first century Roman world, there was no government safety net. There was no Social Security, no Medicare, no 401k, no life insurance.
Right. And you are dealing with a deeply patriarchal society where a woman's economic survival was almost entirely tied to a male relative, a husband, a father, or a son.
So without them, she was in trouble.
Severe trouble. If a woman was widowed and had no family support, she faced literal starvation. She was the most vulnerable demographic in the empire. So the early church stepped in to fill that massive gap. They created an internal welfare system to feed and care for these widows.
Which is an incredibly noble thing to do.
It is. But as with any system involving human nature and limited resources, complications arose. And Paul had to establish very strict, unsentimental parameters to keep the system from collapsing under its own weight.
Which introduces a tension that we're still fighting over today, the balance between public charity and personal familial responsibility. Paul lays down the rule. Honor widows that are widows indeed, meaning provide for those who are truly desolate and completely alone in the world.
The ones with absolutely no safety net.
Right. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, Paul drops a heavy, non-negotiable mandate on them. He says those children must show piety at home and to requite their parents.
Matthew Henry has a blistering commentary on the cultural backdrop of this command. He points out that the religious elites of the day, the Pharisees, had engineered a legal loophole to get out of caring for their aging parents. It was a practice called korban.
Right. Jesus confronted them about this in the Gospels. How did that loophole actually work?
Basically, a wealthy son could declare that his money or property was korban, meaning it was formally dedicated as a gift to the temple. By cloaking his assets in this religious designation, he was legally shielded from having to use that money to support his destitute parents. He could claim, "I'd love to help you, Mom, but my money belongs to God."
Oh, that makes me sick.
It was a form of tax evasion and familial abandonment cloaked in hyper-spirituality.
That is sickening. You use God as an excuse to let your mother starve, and Paul just obliterates that loophole. He says that if you fail to provide for your own household, you have denied the faith and is worse than an infidel, worse than an unbeliever.
He does not hold back.
Not at all. He's saying, do not come to our worship gatherings acting super spiritual, singing the songs and praying the prayers if you are letting your own family waste away. True piety doesn't start in the temple. It starts in the home.
It's a profound boundary on charity. The modern relevance is stark. The church, the state, or the nonprofit shouldn't be forced to carry the economic burden that a capable family member is simply refusing to carry.
Because resources are limited.
Exactly. Resources are finite, and Paul is protecting the community's treasury for those who truly have no one else.
And he introduces another boundary that requires real nuance to understand today. He instructs Timothy to refuse younger widows from the official, permanent charity role. The reasoning he gives is that if they are placed on permanent support, idleness will lead them to become tattlers and busybodies, wandering from house to house.
Now, again, to a modern ear, calling younger women tattlers and busybodies can sound incredibly harsh or dismissive.
It sounds a bit condescending.
It does. But we have to look at the underlying psychological and economic principle. Paul is pointing out that misapplied charity can actually enable destructive behavior.
Right. If you give someone permanent, unconditional economic support when they still have the youth, the energy, and the capability to build a life, to marry, to work, to contribute to society, you risk incentivizing complete idleness.
And human nature dictates that idleness rarely stays just idle. As Henry notes, an unoccupied mind quickly turns to meddling. It turns into gossip, creating unnecessary drama and manufacturing conflict just to have something to do.
Idle hands, basically.
Exactly. Paul is acting as a shrewd administrator here. He is trying to protect the limited resources of the church for the truly destitute elderly, while simultaneously protecting the younger women from the spiritual and psychological decay of having absolutely nothing productive to do with their days.
It is a highly nuanced, incredibly realistic view of human nature and social safety nets. And speaking of human nature, this chapter also addresses how to handle the inevitable conflicts and scandals involving the leaders themselves.
Yes, the accountability piece.
Paul says, don't receive an accusation against an elder without 2 or 3 witnesses. You don't let a leader get canceled over a single unverified rumor.
You need a fair process.
But if they are proven guilty through a fair process, Paul says, rebuke them before all, that others also may fear. No backroom deals, no quiet transfers to another city to cover up the abuse. Absolute, terrifying transparency.
It is a standard of accountability that many modern institutions still fail to uphold today.
Yeah.
But right in the middle of all this heavy administrative burden, the discipline, the welfare systems, there is this deeply human, almost jarring pivot in the text.
Oh, I know what you're going to say.
Paul suddenly interrupts his own flow to tell Timothy, drink no longer water, but use a little wine for thy stomach's sake and thine often infirmities.
I have always loved that verse because it feels so out of place, yet so perfectly placed. We are talking about cosmic apostasy, the intricacies of the welfare system, the public discipline of fallen leaders, and then Paul pauses to say, hey, take some medicine for your tummy.
It's so pastoral.
What do you think is the core takeaway there?
The takeaway is profoundly grounding. It reminds us that spiritual leaders are finite, fragile human beings. Physical bodies matter. Timothy was clearly dealing with chronic stress and health issues, very likely exacerbated by the contaminated water in Ephesus.
Which was a real problem back then.
A huge problem. And Paul, this great apostle who has seen literal miracles, doesn't just say pray harder for healing. He doesn't say if you had more faith, your stomach wouldn't hurt. He gives practical, culturally appropriate medical advice.
Which is so refreshing.
It is. Taking care of your practical physical health is a deeply spiritual act. It ensures you have the stamina to actually do the hard, grinding work of leadership.
And stamina is exactly what Timothy is going to need for the final charge in this letter. Because as we move into chapter 6, having dealt with the crisis of poverty and the logistics of charity, Paul turns his attention to the opposite end of the spectrum, the profound spiritual and psychological dangers of wealth.
This is perhaps one of the most culturally urgent sections in the entire letter. Ephesus was a city dripping with wealth, and that wealth was pulling the community apart.
It was a massive distraction.
Paul establishes the foundational wisdom right up front. He writes, "Godliness with contentment is great gain." And he grounds this in the inescapable, brutal reality of our mortality. "For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out."
It's the ultimate reality check. As the old saying goes, you've never seen a U-Haul pulled behind a hearse.
That's a good one.
But the obstacle we face here is massive because our entire modern economy is built on making sure we are never content. Paul addresses the trap of desiring to be rich. He says, "They that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare." I've always thought about it this way. Chasing wealth as your primary goal is like being stranded on a raft in the ocean and deciding to drink seawater.
The seawater analogy is hauntingly accurate. Let's pull that apart.
Well, when you drink seawater, the salt actively dehydrates you at a cellular level. It tricks your body. It feels like you are quenching your thirst for about 10 seconds, but it's actually accelerating your dehydration.
It's making the problem worse.
Exactly. You become more desperately thirsty, so you drink more, and the cycle continues until it literally kills you. That is what the obsessive pursuit of money does to the human soul.
That is exactly the mechanism Paul is describing. And we must be highly precise with the text here, because it is one of the most misquoted verses in history.
Oh, people misquote this all the time.
Constantly. Paul does not say that money is the root of all evil. Money is just a tool. It's morally neutral. He says the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil.
The love of it.
Furthermore, he doesn't say that being rich is inherently a sin. He says they that will be rich, meaning those whose primary drive, whose obsession, whose central determination in life is to acquire wealth, they are the ones who fall into the snare and are, as the text says, pierced through with many sorrows.
That is a vital distinction. The snare isn't the bank account. The snare is the obsession. And if we translate this into our modern world, the text explicitly warns against men of corrupt minds who suppose that godliness is a means of gain. This is a direct, devastating challenge to two massive modern movements: secular hustle culture and the religious prosperity gospel.
Absolutely. The prosperity gospel equates financial success with moral or spiritual superiority. It treats the divine as a cosmic vending machine, where your piety is the coin you insert to get a guaranteed financial payout.
Right. If you're good, you get rich.
Exactly. Matthew Henry notes that for these false teachers in Ephesus, their whole religion could be summed up in this. They live for gain. They cloak their deep-seated avarice under the pretense of piety. But Paul shatters that illusion.
He tears it right down.
He says, no, true gain isn't acquiring more stuff. True gain is having godliness with contentment. The Greek word used there is autarkia, which describes a mind completely satisfied with its lot, totally independent of external circumstances.
So it begs the question, what about the people who are rich? What if you are listening to this and you have built a successful company or you inherited wealth? Are you just doomed? What is the instruction for those who actually have means?
Paul anticipates that exact question, and he provides very specific instructions for the wealthy. Notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't command them to take a vow of poverty. He doesn't tell them to feel guilty for their success.
He doesn't shame them for having money.
No. Instead, he addresses the two greatest psychological temptations of wealth, arrogance and false security. He tells Timothy to charge the rich that they be not high-minded nor trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God.
Uncertain riches. That hits hard in an era of crypto crashes and volatile stock markets.
Exactly. Riches are inherently uncertain. A market crash, a lawsuit, a sudden catastrophic illness, it can all vanish overnight. Therefore, their trust, their core security, must remain in the giver, not the gift.
And then he tells them exactly what to do with that wealth. He says, do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to distribute, willing to share. They are called to convert their temporal, fleeting wealth into eternal impact by being wildly generous.
Which brings us to the final emotional peak of the letter. Paul turns his focus squarely back to Timothy. He calls him a man of God, and he issues a final charge. Flee these things. Run away from the greed, the vain jangling, the toxic ambition.
Just run from it.
And instead, follow after righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, meekness. And then he says, fight the good fight of faith. Lay hold on eternal life.
Fight the good fight. It's an acknowledgement that this isn't going to be easy. Maintaining this kind of integrity in a world that rewards toxicity is going to feel like a battle every single day.
Yeah.
And that is the question that lingers for all of us as we close this deep dive.
It's the ultimate question.
Are you fighting the right battles? Are you laying up a good foundation against the time to come by being generous today? Or are you just chasing the wind, drinking seawater, hoping it will finally satisfy you?
Such a powerful summary.
Let's trace the incredible path we've walked today. We started in chapter 1 with that brilliant paradigm shift, realizing that the ultimate goal of any rule or debate must be love from a pure heart, not just winning an argument.
The foundational shift.
We watched Paul dismantle elitism by openly confessing his own broken past. We moved into the radical subversion of praying for our enemies and stripping the ego out of our public gatherings. We explored an architecture of leadership that values quiet character and a peaceful home over flashy charisma.
No novices allowed.
Exactly. We navigated the incredibly tricky, nuanced waters of public charity, balancing deep compassion with hard boundaries to prevent enabling destructive idleness. And finally, we arrived at the secret to true wealth, finding deep, unshakable contentment rather than letting the love of money pierce our lives with endless sorrows.
It is a profound, masterful progression. Paul takes Timothy from the internal, hidden motives of the leader's heart out into the chaotic, messy public square of Ephesus, and then anchors him back in the eternal perspective of what truly matters at the end of a life.
It really is a masterclass. And that leads me to a final thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. Right at the very end of the letter, as he signs off, Paul warns Timothy to avoid oppositions of science, falsely so called.
An interesting phrase to end on.
It is. Barnes interprets this as false, arrogant philosophy that claims to have all the secret answers to life. In our modern era, we are relentlessly bombarded with these new philosophies. We are sold the idea that ultimate fulfillment is just one life hack away, whether it's through extreme wealth generation or biohacking our bodies to live forever or endless networking to build our personal brand.
We're always looking for the next big secret.
But what if the ultimate hack to a meaningful life isn't new at all? What if it is incredibly ancient? What if it's simply the intentional pursuit of contentment, the quiet, faithful care of your own family, and the steadfast refusal to let the love of money dictate your destiny?
That is the enduring anchoring power of this text. It holds you steady when the chaotic, muddy waters of the modern world try to pull you under.
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.